What if your IT service desk helped you put your customers first? It can happen when it's powered by the world's most trusted cloud platform. Industry leaders BMC Software and Salesforce.com offer the fastest growing IT service management solution in the market today, RemedyForce. Let's meet Sally. Last week, Sally requested an iPhone by logging a ticket using the hashtag request capability, found exclusively in RemedyForce. IT got a request, and Sally got her iPhone. All was good until her mobile email stopped working. No worries. Sally jumps on to the RemedyForce self-service portal, and before submitting a service request, she checks out the articles section and quickly finds a possible solution to her problem by resetting her phone. Sally finds easy-to-follow, step-by-step instructions on how to remove and reinsert her SIM card. In this case, resetting her iPhone didn't work, so Sally decides to get help from IT. She gives them information about her problem and submits the service ticket. It's instantly routed to a service desk agent. Now, as an agent, you can start to get more information about Sally's problem. You can quickly tell if there's a problem on a larger scale. Right away, you notice there's planned maintenance. And diving deeper, you see there's a problem associated with the server and email on mobile devices. It also looks like someone has already issued a request for change, so you check out the latest status. Good news! There's a rollout plan, a backup plan, and information about who approved the change. It looks like Sally's email will be back up and running in no time. That makes Sally happy, and you a hero. Email is just one of the many critical business services your customers rely on. And with RemedyForce, you can monitor the status of any business or IT service at a glance. Deployment is fast and easy with no hardware or software to manage. Upgrades are automatic, so you'll always be on the newest version with the latest features. And RemedyForce is accessible to customers anywhere, anytime, on any device. Keep your employees happy and your business thriving. Try RemedyForce today.
Hi there, I'm John Hall, and I'd like to thank you for attending tomorrow's Future Today, Winter 2014. This is a conference that I was really inspired by last year when I saw the 2013 conferences. I definitely felt I wanted to be a part of things, so it feels like a real privilege to have been voted to present here to you today. If anybody's attending from the Pink Elephant Conference over in Las Vegas, where by my reckoning, it's 1 in the morning. I'd like to give you extra thanks for your dedication and your stamina. Okay, today I'm going to take a look at how some of the big consumer tools are bringing in new trends and new features and new facilities that are genuinely changing industries. They're proving to be huge disruptors. So we'll look at how, in some cases, this has led to real conflict. In others, it has almost disrupted entire industries out of existence. And the way it's also changing the way customers see ownership of data and the value of what might actually be other people's data to their own day-to-day life. We'll look at some concrete examples of how IT is already being impacted by these trends. And we'll take a look at what lessons we might be able to learn from it, both warnings, but also potential to benefit from these trends. So firstly, a little about me. My name is John Hall. I've been working in ITSM pretty much my whole career, right back to being a graduate trainee at Yellow Pages here in the UK, which was a real big ITIL pioneer. It was a very lucky place to be. Today, I work as a product manager on the R&D side, and I'm focused on ITSM tool sets, and in particular, the way we need to move them forward with increasing mobilization of the workforce, with increasing consumer trends impacting IT. I found Corinne Jones's presentation previous to mine very interesting because I'm a member of one of those highly global virtual teams. I'm based over in Reading in the United Kingdom, whereas the rest of my team is spread around the globe. And that made that presentation very, very astute, very well observed. I recommend it if you're like me and you're a remote worker. And then Finally, I currently work for BMC Software. I've been there since 2008, having previously worked as a practitioner and consultant and toolset developer out in the field. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at Uber. And if you're not familiar with Uber, Uber is essentially a taxi and limo booking service. It's driven mainly from a mobile consumer app. Although interestingly, when you analyze Uber, it's really two applications because the drivers who can deliver the service have an application too. Now, the important thing about Uber is it's out there right now basically finding an awful lot of conflict. That there's a highly established regulatory framework that governs its industry. And so in many places, particularly over in North America, it's really running into problems city by city. It's having to overcome roadblocks whereby, you know, both regulators and also the key, I suppose you could say, customers of those regulators, the taxi drivers, are launching legal action to try to block Uber's operations. And often what's cited is that, you know, that Uber doesn't conform to the regulations. So I find this a really interesting thing. I took a look at these regulations, and you know, there's a bit of a common theme. If we look at this example from New York, we're talking about setting and enforcing a standard of service. In Ireland, it's very similar. You know, they're looking to regulate conduct, behavior, and essentially the appearance of taxi drivers. And actually, it's kind of cool that this goes right back to Oliver Cromwell here in the UK. This is the earliest example of taxi regulation I could find from 1654. But a really common thread through these is that regulators exist to provide a safety net, a minimum standard of behavior to which all drivers and operators must adhere. And of course, there is a very important safety aspect to that. You know, we don't want to be driving around in unlicensed cabs with no insurance, and we certainly don't want people to be, you know, to be violent or criminal behavior, criminals who might put us under some kind of threat. But you know, the theme still is that the baseline is a minimum. And Uber, they do that stuff too. You know, they do pay a lot of lip service to, you know, vetting drivers, checking insurance, but they don't put that to the fore at all. So what Uber do is they look at the feedback. They position customer feedback as the absolute key driver of what they're doing. And so as a result, feedback is the brand. It's the brand of the drivers. If you go on Uber's website, everything is about the feedback. We look at these profiles, we can see that, you know, that Evans here, we learn a little about him, we learn what he used to do. We see that his feedback is 4.8 star. It's pretty good, rating 4.8 out of 5. The branding then is not the safety net. It's there, it's mentioned on the website, but they push this feedback system to the fore. So when we look at the old way and the new way, we see some really fundamental differences. You know, the existing old school taxi system, you know, I can book a taxi by telephone, but I don't really know who's coming, or I can hail a ride on the street, but I get whoever happens to come by. Whereas what Uber are doing by consumerizing the experience, by putting it there on an application, I can see who is coming, I can see where they are, I get a pretty accurate view of when they're arriving. You know, I joke that when I lived in Slough in the UK, which was a very taxi dependent town, I'd argue, because it's by UK standards, it's sprawled a long way. We used to joke that, you know, we'd phone a taxi and they'd spend the next half hour lying to us, that the taxi would spend an awful lot of time, it seems, just approaching the end of our road, sir, when really it was nowhere near. With Uber, we don't have that. We can trust the drivers because to be there because we know they're coming. And that whole process integrates the experience. So instead of being this kind of telephone call and then uncertainty and then eventually someone arrives, we've got the whole experience played out end to end through the window of an application. I can do everything from ordering right through to payment. You know, I don't need to be rummaging around in my pockets for change, and in my case I'm clumsy, so I usually spill most of it down the side of the seat, because that whole payment system is done automatically. Even the tipping is done automatically. I also have this feeling of choice. I'm not just picking up a phone and dialing a voice who I don't really know. I don't know the Uber driver either, but I can pick which car I want to come and get me. I can learn, I feel that I'm in control, and therefore I'm selecting who's delivering my service. But underpinning all that is this change in trust. Uber is not accountable directly to the regulator, and that's really driving the regulators mad. Instead, they build on reputation. And that reputation is both important to the individual drivers, but also to Uber as an entirety. It wouldn't be good for Uber if I opened up my application and looked at the local drivers and I found that everybody was 2 or 3 star. I wouldn't use that service. So, the feedback is about driving trust and excellence. So that's an example of one such scenario which is driving conflict. But in other cases, this trend is really changing entire businesses. It's changing industries, and it's literally pushing businesses down a hole. So I'm a big fan of travel guidebooks. I have a stack of these books upstairs. I haven't even been to all the countries. We usually find that if we have an idea of going to a country, we've always sort of gone out and bought the guidebook. It's kind of a habit. And that habit out there was really at its peak in the mid-first decade of this millennium, where Lonely Planet was the giant and was actually snapped up by the British Broadcasting Corporation for a pretty large amount of money. If we look at these figures here, they were selling 6 million guidebooks a year. That was about half of the entire guidebook industry. They were a big player. The website, 4.3 million visitors a month. Now, hold that thought, because when we look at a modern comparison, 4.3 million suddenly doesn't sound like much. So this was 2005, and this was the big brand in travel guidance. People trusted Lonely Planet. People still do. But then there's been a huge change in the way these services are consumed. So last year, the BBC sold on Lonely Planet, and they took a big loss on this. They bought it emerged for 130 million pounds. So the loss amounted to 80 million British pounds. So we're talking $130 million in, I guess, I'm talking to potentially a sort of Oceania time zone audience. This is a big number. This is 800 crore Indian rupees. It's a lot of money. More than half their money gone, and a huge amount of value wiped out of the transaction. And that's really driven by a huge decline in sales of these types of books. Remember we said that Lonely Planet in 2005 was selling 6 million books a year. Well, currently the whole market has declined to pretty much 6 million books a year. A Nielsen book scan is essentially predicting a trend down towards 0, and the reality is following that trend. So what's happened to the travel guidebook market? Well, I'd argue probably the biggest thing that's happened to travel guides is TripAdvisor. So this is not a guidebook publisher at all, of course. It started as a website, but really now, like a lot of these consumer applications, like Evernote and a myriad of others, it's now a cross-platform digital consumer experience. And they've even started branding themselves now. They've trademarked this phrase, world's most trusted travel advice. That word trust again. Whereas Lonely Planet was an authority before, TripAdvisor now see themselves as the foremost authority in this business. And they are just doing brilliantly. Their growth has been enormous, and it continues to be. I mean, last year they had 50% year-on-year traffic growth, and they're claiming 2 billion unique visitors during last year. So compared to that, 4-point-something million visitors a month on a website, this is a mega trend. This is enormous. That dwarfs that previous figure. And when we look at the difference, it's again, we can see similar differences. With TripAdvisor, I don't have a snapshot of something. So if my travel book is 2 or 3 years old, then stuff has changed in 2 or 3 years. They might be recommending businesses that have changed hands, or there may be things that have shut down, or there may be new things that I'm missing. Whereas TripAdvisor gives me that real-time view of things. So, I've been a consultant. I've worked out there in the field and stayed in hotels, and, I've explained to my peers and family that it's not quite the glamorous existence that they think it might be when you're sitting in a restaurant by yourself in the evening. But at least TripAdvisor lets you get a decent restaurant. The coverage of a guidebook is by its nature limited. I mean, if we look at the photo on this rack, Germany's a pretty big country, but it warrants probably a 500-page book. If we look at your figures like the Zagat reference guide, I did a little research on that, and it was reckoned that they cover about 5% of restaurants in Los Angeles with their Los Angeles guidebook. 5%. So, even if that's an even spread, there's a 1 in 20 chance of a restaurant that I might be interested in being in the book. And even then, we have that problem that the rating might be a little old. Another problem with it is that it's an expert opinion. That's not necessarily bad, but it's one expert, or maybe they've curated a little bit of feedback from a few people. If we look at this TripAdvisor screenshot here, the top attraction in Bristol here in the UK, a city I really love just up the road, 206 reviews on the top attraction. So I'm getting the benefit of a lot of people's views. Now that has its downside as well, that we have to learn as consumers to separate the signal from the noise. But then actually what sites like this are doing, what Amazon are doing, for example, you can even review the reviewers. So they push the best reviewers to the top based on other people's feedback. And that again is a trust mechanism. If people have really ranked highly one person's reviews, then they bubble to the top and we see the best of the best at the top. But then also there's one other thing that I think is really different about TripAdvisor. I mentioned that situation where I'm sitting in the hotel and I want to know where there might be a good restaurant nearby. Well, with a book, I've got to figure out where I am, where the restaurants are. I maybe need a map. TripAdvisor offers contextual delivery. And like many such services, it benefits from already knowing where I am and be able to geolocate those restaurants. And I can quickly say I want to know the nearest Mexican restaurants with more than 3 stars, and I'll see them. So it changes the expectations of consumers of services too, that they can do this kind of thing, whereas often in the old world they couldn't. That combination of trust and context is a very powerful thing, and we see that in what's happening with the results of these two organizations. We'll take a look now at another similar site, Yelp.com, which again is a sort of a broad consumer review site. And in this case, one of the interesting things is that Yelp has been studied by Harvard Business School. It's back in 2011, and it's a well-quoted survey, so it's pretty easy to find. When Harvard analyzed the effects of Yelp, and this is with a USA focus, but this kind of site is global. They worked out that a 1-star increase in a restaurant's Yelp rating would really boost their revenue. And 5 to 9%, it doesn't necessarily sound a lot, but in the hospitality industry, often on quite tight margins, that can be a big increase in profitability. It's not just about the revenue. But then when they study the effect on the branded chains, those big name restaurants that, big national and global chains that are familiar to most of us, they found out that the effect was pretty much 0. And when you look into that, when you think about that, our trust has often been reinforced by the brand name. In a world of uncertainty, when our guidebook covered 5% of restaurants and we weren't even sure that the rating was up to date, and when in that absence of information, one thing that would at least guarantee us we felt a reasonable standard of service, maybe not the best, but a consistent and predictable service, would be the brand name on a restaurant. What things like Yelp are doing is they're taking away that barrier of uncertainty. I don't need to count on the brand name of a restaurant if 200 people are telling me, hey, this is a really great restaurant. And so one of the things that is happening here is, again, an incumbent mechanism of trust is being attacked. The single assurance that we had before, that we could probably get a meal that we could predict. Now we don't need to rely on that. And it's an interesting question for IT departments. Are we the taxi regulator? Are we the brand name? And are our consumers now expecting to be able to benefit from better information? And really, you know, are they now entitled, or do they feel entitled to expect that we can't enforce our role as this trust provider? And we see this happening. I mean, this is a story from just last month about a product called Course Table. Now, Course Table is a tool that was built by some students at Yale University in the United States. And I'll just start by giving a little bit of context to that. So Yale, you know, being one of the more prestigious universities in the US, and I guess that probably means it comes with tuition fees to match. At Yale, students are encouraged to take a broad range of courses and classes. So one of the things that Yale had done was provided an online course directory, which enabled them to, you know, build out a timetable and select their courses. In a parallel activity, Yale also collected feedback on courses from students, but they never really amalgamated it and, you know, presented it in one place. It was there to be found, but it wasn't something they pushed to the forefront. So two students saw a need to actually build something new, and they built a product that ended up being called Course Table. And it's simply a site that pulls together a bunch of different open sets of data. So it pulls together the course timetable, the professors who are teaching that course, but then it also brings in a couple of other cool things. So firstly, they got hold of that rating data, and they amalgamated it and averaged it all out and aligned it with the courses. So now if I'm interested in a course, I want to go and see what the rating was and maybe sort by it. And then, this being, you know, a very social crowd in a very socially enabled world, they also did a couple of other cool social things. So firstly, you know, I could look at which of my Facebook contacts had also shown interest in a particular course, or I can look at my best friends' set of courses that they may already have lined up. So I can align pretty closely with what my friends are doing. You know, this is something that clearly added value, because out of about 5,000 students, more than 2,000 opted to use this tool. So what would you think the reaction of the university would be? I mean, to me, I'd be thinking, you know, I'd like to think that they would congratulate the students on a job well done. In fact, they went and blocked it. They asserted that that data had never been intended to use in that way. And so students trying to open the Course Table product from Yale were greeted with this. You know, I'd argue this is a very, very wrong way to respond. I mean, to add insult to the fact that they blocked it, this standard disclaimer here talks about malicious activity. I mean, to argue malice is really a very, very strong statement in this case. So, of course, there was a predictable backlash. I mean, you can't get away with doing something that people consider pretty unreasonable. And as a result, they the media found that there was what the media did was they launched against this in a big way. If you excuse me, it looks like I'm not sharing the slides anymore. Okay, so apologies. I'm not sure why the presentation had stopped sharing my slides. That is disappointing. Okay, so here we are. This is the news site from Bloomberg. It's going to show this, you know, and there are a lot of articles like this. This one includes an interesting quote from the Dean of Students, you know, who stated, "Technology has moved faster than the faculty could have foreseen. And it's a sign that questions of who owns the data are evolving before our eyes." You know, that they've conceded now that in doing this, they've actually made a big mistake. They've taken the students here have just taken data that's publicly available, and they might have done something with it that it wasn't intended to do in the first place, but it kind of shows who feels they own that data. And actually, rating data, when we look a little wider, you know, that it's not just the courses that students are rating. There's a site called Niche in which students rate their classes, their universities. And this is an example of Stanford. Now, Stanford, of course, is buried deep in Silicon Valley. You would really expect them to to do pretty well, and they have. They're ranked top of thousands of colleges in the US on computing. So this is people rating their IT department, and it's out there in public and in the shop window. This is again something very important, a very big trend. Now the other side of it, we've seen a good review. Here's a bad one. So this is Yelp. If I'm a student and I'm interested in attending a university in a competitive market, well, this is a big university in the States, and this review is out there, really damning the IT department. So all of a sudden, the performance of our internal IT function is impacting our public image externally. Now here's the crunch. I mean, this is, we talked about the fact that these are consumer trends, but this is already happening to us. So this is a site called Glassdoor. And now Glassdoor is, it's essentially a site that enables people who might be looking to start employment with a company to get an understanding from insiders of what it's like to work for that company. I'd also argue that customers might be interested in a lot of this data as well. If I'm going to sign a big contract with a company, then I kind of want to know what their own staff think of them. And if you look on this site, if you do a search for IT on this site, these are typically non-IT employees who are complaining that their IT departments are holding them back, that there are big problems with IT in these organizations. So again, this is out there. You may already be being reviewed if you're part of a corporate IT department. Consumer trends in general are, we already know that they're hitting IT. I promised you evidence. I mean, most of these things are probably things that are already very familiar to people who work in the business of IT. But we're seeing, tools that really started in the consumer market forcing their way into the business, whether businesses like them or not. So this top quote here, when Evernote launched their business service, about 85% of people, according to Evernote's CEO, were bringing in Evernote on their own back. They hadn't asked IT, they were just using it. Then we see the big trend of bring your own device. I mean, there are endless articles and blogs and pieces of research you can read on this. I figured actually, given the time zone I was presenting to, I'd take a look to ensure that that the trend was happening in the Asia and Pacific and Japanese region. And is it ever? I mean, the numbers are huge. And I thought this quote from a VMware study was really interesting in two ways. I mean, firstly, the first number, 83% of employees bringing their own devices to work, that's normal. It's a big number, but that's pretty predictable. But interestingly, a large percentage of them cited the fact that it was to ensure contactability by their clients. So this takes it a step further, I think. This is this is our employees telling us that their consumers, their customers, expect to be able to contact them in different ways that the business is not yet supporting. And then finally, as another example here of the real impact of this, this isn't directly just about consumerization, but it talks to the expectations of IT's end customers, its users. And this is from a Forrester study that the BMC actually commissioned last year. And Forrester went out and talked to a huge number of people, both in IT and outside, so nearly 1,000 of each, IT users, business users. One of the headlines was that IT thought it was doing a lot better than the business thought it was doing. Typically, the 15 percentage points better on a satisfaction index. So a big difference. And there were some horrible numbers about, the amount of impact on people's working month. Typically 16 hours of lost productivity was cited by a large number of people as an average. So, that effectively customers feel that IT is getting in their way. And when you drill into it, it's not, as I say, it's not just consumerization. I mean, a lot of it's just down to problems, but there is certainly a feeling out there that if IT is too restrictive, it isn't just annoying. It doesn't just stop people having nice to haves. It's also giving people, it's stopping people doing their job properly. So what can we do as IT organizations? Well, I think it's pretty clear we can't ignore this. We have to embrace consumer trends. And let's look at the positive side of things. We've talked at the start of the presentation about Uber. And I found this great review on Yelp.com of Uber, and it's actually not a review by an end customer, which is probably the intention of that particular review forum on Yelp, but it was from a driver. And the driver talked about how, at first they struggled to get a good rating. They weren't really sure, what best to do. And what Uber did was they actually coached them. They got in there and helped them to use that rating to sort of build up their confidence in their service. And now they're running at a pretty high rating, having been helped out by Uber to get there. This last line, I strive to keep my rating high and provide the best service. As we said before, that rating on an individual basis, it isn't something we tend to do in business, but maybe we need to think about getting more granular and using it as a positive construct and not see it as such an outside thing or a threat. We see a similar thing happening with TripAdvisor on a huge scale. So TripAdvisor has always allowed management responses, or at least certainly for years has allowed management of hotels and hospitality businesses to respond to reviews. And those responses are just growing hugely. They've more than doubled. There was a really good example I found where, a hotel in Anaheim was struggling badly. They were 80th out of 100 and something, about 100 hotels. And so they decided to, launch an initiative to act in a very detailed way on the feedback they were getting on TripAdvisor. I mean, TripAdvisor has always been sort of seen as a kind of powerful thing, but this was really interesting because it starts showing evidence that people are using it as a driver to improve. And they did a number of things at this hotel. They made the internet access free, whereas previously it wasn't. And I even like this little line that, that they simply just changed their breakfast cereal to a branded breakfast cereal. And that alone, the hotel owner claimed, got a really good response. So, they're still not at the top of the tree. They're 23rd currently out of 111 hotels in the city. But I don't know. I think from my personal point of view, I wouldn't want to go and stay in a hotel that was 80th out of 111. I'd be okay with 23rd. I reckon that would probably be, particularly in the price range that I'm likely to be able to spend on our expenses policy. It's, which is like most of us, probably allows a reasonable standard, but not the best of, the very best hotels in a city which might occupy those top places. 23rd is pretty good. I'd stay there. And actually, in the process, they've even earned themselves last year a certificate of excellence. So this, again, great example of how you could take that feedback and potentially make yourself much better with it. As we go broader than just feedback, there's so many great examples of consumer tools doing things well out there. So this is just the Amazon marketplace. We're pretty familiar with it, I think. In this case, if I want to buy, this is my favorite novel. If I want to buy this, I can buy straight from Amazon here for £6.29. But I have a set of other providers I can choose from. So Amazon is that broker of services. It's doing it in retail, but it's the broker of services that IT is being asked to become here in business. And what Amazon have always done with that with this is they haven't just pushed price. I can remember the early days of internet retail where it was often reckoned that the price comparison sites would be huge. They would be the big driver and everyone would shop, lowest price. But actually, when you look at what's happened, they haven't really been. Amazon remains pretty dominant. The field is dominated by a bunch of big brands. And although those price comparison sites are there, Google has one, of course, they're not really right at the sort of peak of everyone's. They're not riding the zeitgeist at all. So I think what differentiates Amazon from pure price comparison here is that I also have the service aligned with it. So I'm not just looking at the price. I can see that the top bookseller here is 96% positive. Not bad. Yeah, that's pretty good. But although 1 in 25 people clearly think that they've had a negative experience. And of course, with Amazon, you can rate almost anything. I can rate the product I'm buying. I can tell Amazon whether I thought a particular user's review is useful or not. And that, of course, does that filtering process, trust in trust. I even got emailed by them the other day to ask if I could rate the packaging on a recent deal. So they really understand the power of feedback, but they're applying it to this kind of service brokerage. And if that's what IT is being asked to do, maybe we need to see that our consumers want more than just a flat list, the flat menu. They want to know what their peers think of things. Contextual support, I mean, this is something that the consumer world does everywhere. It does it great. And I could have put a screenshot of something like Google Now here, which I'm a big fan of, that sort of insightful, proactive assistant that sits on my Android phone. But actually, I thought this was a really good example because it's in a non-traditionally technical industry. I live here in Reading. There's a big sort of technical town, but also a big commuter town for London. And what we're looking at here is the number 17 bus route that goes cross town across Reading. And I like this. This is just a simple example of some really nice contextual data, because normally I would have got off the bus, walked towards the train station, which is a few hundred meters, and probably had my phone out checking train times. It's nice being able to do that. But in this case, the bus, this is an advertising screen 95% of the time. But as we get near the train station, it just quickly flashes onto the current view of where trains are going. It just saves me a little bit of hassle. It's a nice example of how a service provider has understood its customers at a point in time, at a location, and has used a little bit of contextual support to just smooth out the day. We also need to think, I guess, about how much we can let go in IT. I mean, the trouble is, if we're still accountable for disasters, if we let too much go as an IT organization and we end up with a data breach or a major outage, or if people simply lose stuff, I mean, if cloud services become business critical outside our line of sight, whose risk is that? What happens if that project management tool goes out of business? So maybe we need to take a good look perhaps at the structured tools like IFTTT, IFT, and Zapier, because these are kind of cool. These allow us to use the APIs on services, on a huge range of services, to just do stuff for us that's very personal. So I might want a particular type of email to result in me getting a text message. So why not? That's the sort of thing that would enable our business users to really personalize what they do, and it means we don't have to try and second guess how they can best do their job. But if we can incorporate tools like this into the workplace, then we can actually give them an immense sense of freedom while keeping things relatively contained. If we have control over the points of data transfer, at least to a reasonable extent, while letting them go and do their thing, then that should be pretty powerful, I think. So just to summarize, I mean, let's look at some of the old versus new and think about how we can learn lessons and take IT forward from here. One of the real things I think that probably will change, just simply because feedback has become so huge across multiple industries, is we probably need to get out of a traditional model of old school satisfaction surveys. I mean, ITIL is very, ITIL is full of this stuff. Of course, we have, we have a lot of, there's a lot of things about customer feedback, but we've often just tried to own it ourselves as IT. Do a study every 6 months, maybe even rate people's experiences transaction by transaction, but it's always been our data. It's not visible to customers, and we have to ask ourselves, I think, how sustainable that is moving forward. When we look at the examples of Uber, I mean, as I said at the start, it's not one application, it's really two. It's the driver's application and the customers. So service provider, service consumer, and a huge amount of the power of them is the way they integrate together. But we need to look at better collaboration in our tool sets between ourselves as service providers, and also perhaps between us and the customer. A really great example of this is the Amazon Mayday button on the new Kindle Fire models, where you press a button and get video support. And they're averaging 9 seconds response time. So they've really brought that, they've really gone big on that. And I think that's a very impressive model for service. Of course, this is something that will probably be discussed in lots of other presentations today. I have already seen it come up in a number of them. We're not necessarily a single monolithic service provider anymore. We have, if we're acting as that broker of services, then that's probably happening anyway to a lot of organizations. Let's think about the best way we can portray and deliver and allow people to select those services, and learn from some of these consumer sites in the way they do that successfully. We should look to personalize, take some of the, take away this assumption that we know best. even if it's not a real assumption, if we're perceived to be assuming it, to know better than people about how they do their jobs, then that's going to generate negative feeling, and numbers like that, 15 percent point gap between what we think we're doing and what our customers think we're doing. I think that technology is, as we've shown, is now enabling us to personalize while retaining hopefully enough control, certainly more control, and we need to think very hard about how we personalize these things. And so finally, that control is a really crunch point here. What do we do? How much ground can we give? And there's probably a certain negotiation or even tension that has to be overcome to come to a point where we're making customers happier, perhaps not happiest, because we probably need to keep a degree of control, but we are enabling them to move forward. So it becomes a real governance challenge, and it's something that has to be thought about very, very carefully. But if we can do these 5 things, I'd argue that we move from this sort of old school monopolized trust. Right now, IT, I think, risks being seen as that taxi regulator who is obstructing, even with the best reasons at heart, potentially obstructing the way people actually want to do things. Or that guidebook that has always existed as a kind of, arguably almost self-appointed source of oversight and trust and guidance, but could easily be usurped entirely by a new wave of expectations and services. If we can move away from the old and to the new, then I think it gives IT the chance to earn its trust and to be seen as more supporting and more enabling. And if we do this on our terms, or at least on negotiated terms, we can hopefully also retain that important control over what we need to do. Okay, so I apologize if the slides weren't visible for the first half of the presentation. I'm not quite sure what happened there. So what I will do, that if you look, please feel free to visit my Twitter feed. I'm at John Hall, then with an underscore following that. The slides are already up on SlideShare, and so hopefully that'll help you if you'd like to sort of see some of the earlier material. Once again, I'd really like to thank you for being here today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the presentation. I know I will do too, and I look forward to speaking with you again sometime. Thank you very much.